Thanks very much, Johnny, and welcome to all of you here at the Smithsonian. Let me begin by saying that I'm particularly impressed by the commitment of the 23 organizations that have worked together to produce this fifth State of the Birds report. Working at the Smithsonian with 19 museums and 9 research institutes, I know what trying to get people to work together is all about, and I really appreciate the leadership shown by the directors of these organizations in bringing their staff together to produce this report, which is very important. I'm also very pleased and excited that the Smithsonian, which is the first year to take part in this exercise, can host this event today. Bringing federal, non-federal, academic and nonprofit organizations is something that we try to do all the time, and I think this fifth State of the Birds report is a good example of how the Smithsonian can help convene such things. It's also highly appropriate that we're hosting this particular effort on birds because the Smithsonian has been involved in ornithological research really since its beginning over 160 years ago. Today, 3 of the 12 secretaries of the Smithsonian have been ornithologists. Dillon Ripley, who was so passionate about birds, in the 1960s, he tried to establish a breeding pair of barn owls right here in the castle. And if you went through that door over there and up the North Tower, you would see where he tried to get these 2 birds to mate and stay. Unfortunately, he was not successful, but we may try that experiment again. Undersecretaries are involved in ornithological research, also including myself. Although I'm trained as a botanist, I work primarily on the interactions between plants and animals, and specifically birds and the flowers they pollinate and the fruits that they disperse. So even though we may not directly work on birds, many of the researchers, whether they're at the Tropical Research Institute in Panama, whether at the Conservation Biology Institute in Front Royal, whether at the Natural History Museum, all of us work on nature, on biodiversity, and birds in many ways. So again, it's very appropriate that we're hosting this report. Some of you may know that in 1989, Russ Greenberg, the former director of the Migratory Bird Center, and colleagues from the USGS published a seminal paper alerting the world to the plight of birds and the threats they faced in today's world. In fact, Russ's work was so important that this fifth report on the state of the birds is dedicated to the work that Russ did as a director of the Migratory Bird Center. This year, which maybe makes this report a little bit more important than past reports, also marks the 100th anniversary of the death of the last member of the passenger pigeon species. Some of you may know that the passenger pigeon over the course of decades went from one of the most abundant bird species in the world to extinction. And this 100th anniversary, I think, marks the time when we should think about our effect as humans on the planet and what that means for not only bird species, but for all species on the planet. We have one of the 2 of the last passenger pigeons, a specimen of that bird here. Those birds, many of you have heard of Martha, which is actually in an exhibit over at Natural History now that the Smithsonian has to mark this 100th year anniversary of the demise of this species. Those 2 species of the passenger pigeon are only 2 of 125 million species that the Smithsonian specimens that the Smithsonian has. And we use those specimens on a daily basis, not only understand species in the past, but to understand how species are going to react in the future. That's what we do at the Smithsonian. I would like to say, as part of that, we can't say celebration of 100 years of the demise of the species, but we can mark the anniversary of that, and I'd like to recognize the very moving piece that John Fitzpatrick published in the New York Times several weeks ago on the passenger pigeon and what that says a lot about our species, our own species and the rest of the 10 million species on the planet. It's quite amazing to think that a species that was so exuberant that only several decades can become extinct. So it's a lesson for us to think about. Also, this year, we have another project called the Lost Bird Project, and if you go out into Enid Haupt Garden right outside here, you can see models of Todd McGrain, who have modeled 5 of these species, including the passenger pigeon that have gone extinct over the last century. We are actively carrying out conservation activities not only with birds but with all species and habitats at the Smithsonian through our Conservation Commons effort, which is led by the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, but which is participated in by all scientists at the Smithsonian, or at least a great majority of those. This 2014 State of the Birds report emphasizes that science and conservation, when applied appropriately though, can reverse the threats that some species face today. And I think that's an important message, that we can solve these problems if we get federal agencies and non-federal agencies and nonprofits and academic organizations to work together to understand the science of these species and to understand and build plans that will allow us to actually bring these species, in many cases, back from the brink of extinction. However, much work lies before us, and I think the State of the Bird report simply tells us that some things are doing a little better than they did before, but many things are not. And I think that's what we have to heed, and that's what this message should be about the state of the birds, as well as all species, and that's where we need to go to in the future. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Ashe, the Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who will talk a bit more about the state of the birds. Dan?
Thank you, John, and thank you, everybody, for being here with us today. It's quite the inspiring location to have this, to be able to talk about this here in this location at the Smithsonian, but in this room. Kind of feels like I'm in church. So, Brother Ford, you're going to pass the basket here later and some contributions. I look around the room, I see lots of great partners here in the room today. I just want to give a particular shout out to our partners at the United States Geological Survey. Ann Kinzinger is here, and we could not do what we do in bird conservation without the great participation of the United States Geological Survey, and also Gordon Myers is here from North Carolina, and our state partners are our best and most important partner in this endeavor of bird conservation. So I'm glad to see Gordon here. This is the second time in 2 weeks that I've been at the Smithsonian Institution to contemplate bird conservation. Last week I gave an interview to BBC about the 100th anniversary of the passing of the last passenger pigeon, and did the interview standing in front of the case where Martha is on display. And it really is, as John noted, it really is a sobering reflection on how quickly we can go from abundance, really one of the most abundant animals on the planet, to extinction. And so as we think about that, we think about the miraculous impact that we can have on the planet. We think about the fact that we stand today at about 7.2 billion people on the planet. By the middle of the century, we'll be sharing the planet with some 9.6 billion people. So when we think about Martha and what happened to her kind in the span of about 5 decades, think about what will happen in the 3 or 4 decades between now and the middle of the century, as we add another 2+ billion people to the planet, people who will be more like us, more affluent, more demanding of the ecological space of the planet. It means that there will be less space for the rest of what we call biological diversity. And so unless we recommit ourselves to the notion that we can make a difference, unless we recommit ourselves to the notion of awareness about the impacts that our actions can have on other occupants of the planet, then we will see more of the the fate that Martha and her kind endured. And so, but it is that miracle of conservation, that thing that we call conservation, and we know that it does work, and the State of the Birds report is that awareness that I'm talking about, the opportunity to take a point in time and think about the consequences of our actions on a significant component of biological diversity, birds that we live with and that we enjoy. We know that it's not going to be enough for us to focus on habitat conservation in one part of the country, like, say, the lower Mississippi Valley, when we're losing 24 acres of native prairie and wetland breeding habitat every hour in the prairie pothole region. We have to see that large picture of conservation, whether it's for waterfowl or shorebirds or arid land birds or forest nesting birds. And the State of the Birds report is that moment of awareness when we can see and we can contemplate the effects of our actions, and then we can begin to think about what is possible if we exercise this thing that we call conservation, and if we take care to put in place the resources and the capacities that are necessary. And of course we see we see things like the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, we see things like the Neotropical Bird Conservation Act, we see the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, we see the Land and Water Conservation Fund, all of which are currently pending before the Congress and need to be reauthorized. So members of Congress need to hear our voice and the voices of many, many thousands of other people to invoke action so that we have the resources and we have the capacities to put conservation to work, to take the awareness and knowledge that's represented in this State of the Birds report and put it into action. And we know when we do that, we can be successful. We know if we do that, that we will be successful. So we all want to see birds filling the skies of America and the world, and not just in glass cases, as we can see Martha on the other side of the mall from here. And so we have to take opportunity at stages like this to be aware, to be engaged, to be involved, and to be successful. And so thank you to everybody who worked on the State of the Birds report and are providing us with this great moment of awareness. And then take a moment to pause and reflect on that, and then let us get to work. A few months ago, I was in New Haven, Connecticut, helping to kick off a new urban partnership with the city of New Haven, and a young woman at that event spoke up and said, where birds thrive, people prosper. And so as you think about the 2014 State of the Birds report, think about that notion, where birds thrive, people prosper. Thank you very much. And I think now, am I turning it back or turning it over to you, John? All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. It's my great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Peter Mara, the head of the Migratory Bird Center at the Smithsonian. The Migratory Bird Center was started in 1991 by an act of Congress, more or less as a direct result of that 1989 paper that Russ Greenberg published. And so Pete is now leading the charge here in terms of bird conservation and studying the movement of birds around the planet. Pete?
Thanks, John. Thanks, Dan. And thanks to all of you for coming here this morning. Welcome to the castle. It's a pretty good job when you can say that in the morning. What I want to talk to you about is the remarkable diversity of birds. The diversity is quite mesmerizing. They are all different sizes, everything from a rufous hummingbird that weighs somewhere between a dime and a nickel to a California Condor that's got a 10-foot wingspan. Can you imagine that? Gigantic bird. They've got incredible diversity of behaviors, from elaborate breeding displays on the ground to elaborate breeding displays in the sky. They occupy almost every elevation. They occur almost in every habitat. Despite this incredible diversity and the stiff competition, I think the passenger pigeon is probably going to go down in history as one of our most famous birds. And not because of its incredible biology, not because Disney or Pixar turned it into a cartoon favorite, Pete the passenger pigeon, but because the passenger pigeon was the result of a catastrophic extinction, one that we'll never forget, and nor should we. It was at one point in time the most abundant bird in America. In 1860, one observer noted that there was a flock estimated to be at 3 billion birds. It was said to be about 300 miles long, took 14 hours from sunup to sundown to pass. I've rarely in my entire ornithological career seen a ribbon of birds where I couldn't see both ends. When I think of this, it's happened, but it's not happened often. They've called this the flowing river in the sky to pass. But it went from billions to none in just a half a person's lifetime. That's quite remarkable. And primarily due to hunting for food. Passenger pigeons were eaten, and there were lots of recipes. I actually found some vintage recipes online. And not surprisingly, some of those recipes called for American chestnuts. So I threw that recipe away. Martha, the last known passenger pigeon, which does reside across the mall, as you've heard this morning, died at the Cincinnati Zoo on September 1st, 1914. There were multiple attempts to try to get a captive breeding program going, but it was unsuccessful. We have George here, right here. This is Helen James, curator of birds at Smithsonian, and Terry Chester, who is the works for USGS and is the curator of birds for North America. And we've got a variety of specimens here that we'll refer to throughout the talk. Martha, and the passenger pigeon more broadly, is now sort of a symbol for the broader threat of extinction. This idea that we can never forget, that we can see something go away forever, like an extinction occur within our own lifetime. But as we reflect on Martha, we have to remember that there's actually been several more recent extinctions that have occurred in time, including the Carolina parakeet. There is a specimen of a Carolina parakeet over there. Last known bird was actually, died in 1918, also at the Cincinnati Zoo. So I'm thinking Cincinnati Zoo, not a very cheery place at this time. I'm guessing the Cincinnati Enquirer probably had a field day with these guys. But it was probably slaughtered because it was considered a pest, an agricultural pest, probably eaten. Feathers were probably used for a variety of things, but another dismal story. There's several others. The Eskimo Curlew, not officially considered extinct right now, but the last confirmed sighting was in 1963. A remarkable bird. It was a long-distance migratory bird that was, probably its extinction was due to a variety of things, including the decline of important habitats, but its fall migration actually took it down through the eastern Rocky Mountains, where we think that a lot of its diet was tied to the Rocky Mountain grasshopper. And that Rocky Mountain grasshopper met its demise because of the expansion of agriculture and the use of pesticides. So it was that real tight linkage between the species and its food resource that also probably contributed to the demise of this remarkable species. The Bachmann's warbler, one of my all-time favorites. I happen to be a warbler guy. You don't meet one of those guys every day, I know. But I'm a warbler guy, and so the Bachmann's warbler is a species that was thought to be tied to canebrake habitats or bamboo in the southeastern United States, thought to winter primarily in places like Cuba. So we think that its demise was probably met due to things like habitat destruction, probably a few other things. But this bird hasn't been seen since 1977. Also not officially extinct. There have been other sightings, nothing really confirmed. And finally, the Po'uli. I'm not really good with the Hawaiian pronunciations, I apologize in advance. The Po'uli was only first discovered in 1972 in the island of Hawaii. The island of Hawaii, you'll hear me say this a couple times today, is sort of the extinction capital of the world. Po'uli was last seen in 2004. Again, just 22 years after it actually been, or 32 years after it had been discovered. Its demise was probably met by a result of several different invasive species, primarily several pathogens, including pox, avian malaria, and a few other pathogens that these birds did not evolve with. These Hawaiian birds were completely naive to many of these pathogens. So when these pathogens were introduced through invasive mosquitoes and other means, many of these species have fallen. In fact, there have been about 10 species of birds that have gone extinct in Hawaii in the last 40 or 50 years, or at least supposed extinctions. But I want to emphasize today, and I think we want to focus on the fact that there are just as many success stories as there are extinction stories, and that conservation works when it's applied properly. This is the Kirtland's warbler. It's a species I actually work on up in the upper lower peninsula of Michigan. This species was down to 200 individual birds in 1972, primarily due to the fact that cowbirds, which are a native species in North America, expanded their range because of agricultural intensification, just a natural expansion, but also because the habitat this bird is tied to, this jack pine forest, is a fire-dependent species of plant. And because of human encroachment and the fact that this bird is living in this human-dominated environment, fire and humans, they don't get along so well. So there needed to be other ways that we manage those habitats. Conservationists took the biological information, they took this important knowledge, and they brought it to the habitat, and they applied it. They started to manage on the ground. This species is now up to 1,700 individuals. We're now studying them both on the breeding grounds as well as on the wintering grounds. It's a conservation-dependent species still, but we're trying to move away from that. But right now, it's a good story. It's a success story. And conservation, when applied with knowledge, habitat, and management, can really work. And it can work effectively to bring back species. Another spectacular bird, a bird I've never seen. It's just driving me crazy. It's the largest bird in North America. It's the California Condor, a wingspan of about 10 feet. So that's from me to the podium. That's about 10 feet. It's a big bird. It's a big bird. This bird was officially declared extinct in the wild in 1987, I believe. 1987. There were several birds that were brought into captivity at the San Diego Zoo, and their remarkable captive breeding program has now gotten 225 birds in the wild as of June 2014, and there are another 214 birds that are still actually in captivity, ready for release. They're flying over several western states now, and this species, for most of you that don't know this, was actually found throughout most of North America back to the Pleistocene. So it'd be wonderful to sort of repatriate this bird in its former range one day. Whoops. And how can we forget the bald eagle and the peregrine falcon and the osprey? Several species, iconic species, that if we oops, sorry, that's what you're pointing out. Thanks, Johnny. The bald eagle is, it's obviously iconic. If we had lost this species, it would have been horrible. But it was DDT primarily. We didn't understand what was going on. We determined the limiting factor with that science, with that knowledge. We applied it. We removed it from the environment. These species are back with gangbusters. I've seen bald eagles fly over the mall, over the castle, multiple times. Ospreys and peregrine falcons are common. It's a wonderful success story. When we apply this information on the ground, we can make things work. We can make conservation work. So, what we have to ask ourselves, and I ask myself this all the time, does it matter if we lose a bird? Does it matter if we lose a species? Well, hell yes, it matters. Of course it matters. It matters for a lot of reasons. First of all, birds are our touchstone to the environment and to nature every day. When you walk outside anywhere in the U.S., in Washington, D.C., you see birds more than you see any other animal, right? And as we grow more and more detached with nature, it's important to have that constant reminder of how we are tied to this environment. Right back here, when I was pacing around the hop garden thinking about my talk, I actually counted 14 different species of birds, including 2 or 3 migrants, a common yellowthroat that was flying through the underbrush. They're all over the place. They're a constant reminder of how important nature actually is. They provide important ecosystem services, everything from pollination to depletion of important plant herbivores, and the list goes on. Seed dispersal, a variety of things. There are also 70 million or so people across the U.S. that value birds, and we have to appreciate those values. That human dimension of this is a really important motivator to our conservation action. Finally, birds are the quintessential canaries in the coal mine. They are superb indicators of environmental health, whether it's disease outbreaks like with West Nile virus or H5N1 around the world. Birds tell us you can't see those pathogens. You've got to look for the dead bodies of birds, unfortunately. They also are integral parts of ecosystems. In many ways, they're the glue that holds these ecosystems together. They are the keystones. When you remove them, many of these ecosystems collapse in ways that we don't notice initially, but eventually these ecosystems lose their integrity and they become compromised. And because they're such integral parts of these ecosystems, we can continue to use them as indicators. And they're also good for indicators because they are so widespread and we understand their biology like no other taxa. We've been studying birds for a long time. Yes, there's still a lot we have to know, a lot to learn, but we understand bird biology like no other taxa. Furthermore, there's an enormous long history of monitoring, whether it's the Bird Banding Lab's database on captures of birds, or the Audubon's Christmas bird counts going back 100 years, or the Breeding Bird Survey data going back almost 50 years. This is a long history of monitoring that allows us to check back in with our birds to see how our birds are doing. Thank you. And as Dan said, healthy habitat means economic well-being. Having healthy ecosystems is important for us as much as it is important for the birds themselves. So that brings us to today. Today it's appropriate that we go back and monitor, thinking about the passenger pigeon, thinking about the Carolina parakeet and the Bachmann's warbler, as well as the successes. If we didn't catch the declines in some of these species, we wouldn't be able to have these conservation stories. So going back and examining the state of the birds of the United States of America, to see how they're doing is critically important to be able to know where conservation action needs to be put into place. So monitoring, looking at these trends over time is essential. The State of the Birds is an enormous effort by 23 different organizations, both federal and non-federal, that have come together to really understand and analyze these data to examine these trends over time, and then make recommendations of how we move forward. To do this, there were two independent indices that were used. First, we used birds as indicators of America's habitats. When I say birds as indicators, basically these are birds that we considered obligate to these specific habitat types. They're specialized on these habitats. They're not, these are the breeding habitats these birds are specialized on, unlike a generalist species, which might be found across multiple species, multiple habitats. These birds are primarily found only in those habitats like grassland or arid lands. And we use long-term trend data from a variety of sources that I'll talk about in just a minute. And then we took the average trend over multiple species to see how that habitat was doing. So in some habitats, like wetlands, we had close to 80 different species that we considered specialized or obligate to that habitat. In other habitats, like arid lands, we might have 30 species or 25 species that were used. But it was the average cost across all those obligate species that we looked at. But we don't have trend data for all species, unfortunately. You know, there are a lot of species out there that we aren't monitoring as well as we are with like BBS or Christmas bird count data. We can't do everything. So we also did the watch list approach, and this was the watch list is something that Audubon has been doing for a while, ABC has been doing for a while. Now we're making it sort of an official part of the State of the Birds. And in this, our methodology was basically to review the conservation status of over 800 species. We considered their global breeding population size, their range size, both on the non-breeding areas as well as on their breeding areas. We considered their threats. Were they on Hawaii and exposed to disease? Was there massive habitat destruction going on in parts of their range? And we incorporated trend data, if available, in these cases as well. The sources of the trend data, the monitoring data, was the North American Breeding Bird Surveys. You can see these surveys are located all over the United States and Canada. It's now expanding into Mexico. This was created by Chan Robbins, a USGS scientist. This was visionary. It was just an amazing thing to put in place. There's all sorts of ways to criticize this, but this is the most amazing data set and thing. It's, you know, people from around the world just gawk at this and think that it's just an amazing thing. If you haven't seen the article, there's a wonderful article in the National Wildlife Federation's magazine on Chan Robbins. Just a wonderful individual. We included National Audubon's Christmas bird count data. This goes back about 100 years, but we only used from 1968 forward to 2012. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey's waterfowl population surveys, which are a census of a variety of duck species. And then for the first time in the State of the Birds, we used 3 different sources of shorebird data. We used the International Shorebird Survey, the Atlantic Canada Shorebird Survey, and the Ontario Shorebird data to assess the state of the nation's shorebirds. And this goes from 74 to 2012. Oops, there we go. So what habitats did we use? Well, we chose primarily 6 habitats. Arid lands in orange, the coastal areas in light blue, eastern forest in this lighter green here, grasslands in tan, central Midwest, and inland wetlands in dark blue and western forest in dark green. And then again, we looked at species that we considered obligate indicators from each of those habitats and looked at their trend over time and took the average trend to indicate how that habitat was doing over time, over that trend. So what do we find? Well, there's some really good news, and then there's some bad news. The good news is for wetland birds. Wetland birds have been showing remarkable increases in their indicator, and this is for over 80 species. This is the average trend over 80 species. This is not necessarily being driven by several birds. This is being driven by a large group of species of birds. We're doing something incredibly right here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. These other four indicators, western forest, grasslands, arid lands, and forgetting one, arid lands, grasslands, and western forests, are not doing so well. We'll talk about each specifically now. So wetland birds are showing a strong population gain, and they've shown an increase of about 37% over that trend, again, across all species. Species like the anhinga, their populations have increased by 76% over that period of time from 68 to 2012. The gadwalls populations have increased by over 200% over that same time frame. Moving on to grasslands, the news isn't all that good. These populations have stabilized, but they've stabilized at extremely low levels. Some of the species that have stabilized are upland sandpiper, which its populations are up about 30% since 1968, and the sharp-tailed grouse. Its population's up about 14%. But there's many grassland birds that remain in steep decline. And we don't think this is due just to things happening on breeding areas. We think a lot of this happens to do with areas where these birds winter. So a lot of the species I'll be talking about are actually migratory species. And these first four species, the lark bunting, McCown's longspur, mountain plover, Sprague's pipit, all spend their winters in Chihuahua. Chihuahua happens to be a place where there's a lot of intense agricultural development going on, taking away important bird habitat in that region for a lot of these grassland birds that are tied to those areas, where they spend the majority of the annual cycle. All these species have seen declines of greater than 75% of their population levels. That is incredible. That is really incredible. Eastern meadowlark, a species that does spend its entire year throughout the US, but it is migratory, has seen declines of close to 80%. And the bobolink, species that has remarkable migrations. It breeds across the US, everywhere from the Northeast out to Oregon. It goes down to South America and then continues down to the southern tip of South America and then back again. Their populations have also declined by greater than 75%. Arid lands, however, are probably showing the steepest declines of all. On average, all these populations have declined by 46% across almost all species. Not all species, but almost all species. The Ben-Dyer's thrasher is just hard to find anymore. Its populations have declined by over 85%. It's getting close to being gone. Scaled quail by over 75%. And LeConte's thrasher, again, by over 75%. So arid lands should be an area where we start to really focus on, really start to understand what's going on. The other thing I need to point out, we don't know why many of these species are declining. We have no idea why the Ben-Dyer's thrasher is disappearing. No idea. Where do you start? It starts with knowledge. We've got to go back to that first bit, start thinking about the science and trying to understand what's going on that's limiting those population sizes. In western forests, there's been an average decline of about 18%. Lewis's woodpecker is a bit on the, it's one of the species that's showing more stark declines of greater than 80%. Pinyon jay, more than 85% of its population has disappeared, and Rufous hummingbird, its populations have declined by over 60%. And then in eastern forests, we're talking about an average decline across our indicator species of more than 32% since 1968. The wood thrush, a common bird that breeds right here in Rock Creek Park and across eastern North America, has declined by over 60% for a variety of reasons. In this case, we think it has a lot to do with tropical deforestation, but we're working very hard to try to understand what's really driving that decline. Cerulean warbler, again, more than 75% decline. Whippoorwill, more than 75%. And the golden-winged warbler, more than 70% decline since 1968. Looking at coastal areas, we're separating this into winter coastal areas and winter coastal species and migratory species. The good news is that many of these coastal birds that remain within the United States for most of the year have responded positively. They've increased by over 25% since 1968. And they've responded positively to a lot of habitat protection and restoration on various national wildlife refuges and seashores. Species like the common eider is quite common. I was just in Maine last week or 2 weeks ago, and common eiders were all over the place. 25 years ago, they weren't that common. Same is true for Harriman skull. The story for shorebirds, however, is quite dire. They won't even show up. Migratory shorebirds, on average, across this entire group, they've declined by over 50%. Species like the red knot has declined by over 95%. And in this case, while a lot of people are pointing towards the Delaware Bay and that incredible linkage between horseshoe crabs and this is an important refueling stop, I think there's a variety of things that actually might be contributing to the decline of the red knot. But it's a species that's rapidly disappearing. Lesser yellowlegs, greater than a 70% decline, and the list goes on. Ruddy turnstones, a variety of others, are just declining drastically. We're losing our shorebirds. We can't lose our shorebirds. So let's move on to the watch list. The list, when tabulated and compiled, ended up having about 230 species of a total of 800 that were actually on the watch list. 95 of these are actually listed as threatened or endangered. If you look at them by habitat, one thing I want to point out is that 100% of the birds in Hawaii are actually on the watch list. All 33 of those species are on the watch list. Species like the ridge-raised rail, a species that's found in California, San Francisco Bay, and south, is on that list and has a very, very restricted range. Sprague's pipit, a species that's rapidly declining and also has a fairly restricted range. The wood thrush, again, declining at 60%, a species we have to keep our eye on, and the ruddy turnstone, declining by over 75%. Hawaii, however, as I mentioned, all 33 birds on the watch list, has got to be the extinction capital of the world. All 33 remaining species require some type of conservation action. Species like the palila, the kauai alapaio, the crested honeycreeper, and the Aki Palau owl. Pretty close? Okay, thanks. All are in trouble. All are in trouble. The Hawaiian crow is actually extinct in the wild now. It was actually taken out in what year? 2000. It was actually taken out of the wild. There's now a population of 100 or so that are at the San Diego Zoo. They can't be released back in the wild because there are still threats that remain. And there's a lot of really committed conservation biologists that are trying to figure this problem out. Oceanic and sea birds, another group. These species face a variety of severe threats, including depletion of prey by overfishing, oil spills, plastic pollution, and of course, one of the most difficult things to predict, climate change. We just don't know how climate change is really going to impact a lot of these species. The Laysan albatross, black-footed albatross, Ashe storm petrel, and even species like the black skimmer, other seabirds that are starting to decline. And shorebirds, seabirds, and other island birds make up nearly half of the watch list. Species like the whimbrel, Hudsonian godwit, and the sanderling, black-capped petrel. They occupy every habitat. The Bicknell's thrush, a species that breeds in boreal forest in the northeastern US and in southern Canada, and winters primarily in the island of Dominican Republic. Its populations are declining, and it's a very restricted range. Greater prairie chicken, and of course, the Gunnison Sage-Grouse. This is a species we're all very concerned about, and we sort of think this might be the next bird to go extinct in the mainland US. It's now isolated to about 5, 6, or 7 leks, maybe 5,000 birds left. And it's tightly tied to sagebrush habitat. Its winter survival is determined by how much sagebrush foliage it can actually eat during these winters. And it's disappearing very rapidly. It has an amazing display on leks. I encourage you to Google the display of the Gunnison Sage-Grouse. We have a greater sage-grouse here in 3D. One of the more alarming things is that there are several species that don't make it to the watch list because they are widespread or they just didn't make our criteria. And when our goal is keeping birds common when they're common and trying to prevent extinction, to try to preserve abundance, these are the species we also have to start thinking about. These are new species that are being added to these lists. And there are 33 still common species that have lost more than 50% of their population size in the past 45 years. It's hundreds of millions of birds. Species like the eastern meadowlark is disappearing. These are all species that I've seen, my anecdotal observations, I'm seeing them decline. You just don't see them very often. All the ornithologists in this room will tell you the same thing. You just don't see eastern meadowlarks very often. Common nighthawks. I used to see hordes of these in New Haven, nesting on the rooftops. I bet you didn't see any common nighthawks last week. It's probably late for them now, but if you were there in June, you wouldn't see them breeding there anymore. Bobwhite, chimney swift, rusty blackbird, species that's declined by over 80%. Just disappearing. Another case of enigmatic declines. We don't know what's causing these declines for many of these species. We can guess, but how much do you want to invest in guessing? But we have to remember when we think about these problems, when we think about the state of the birds, we have the tools in many cases to put them into action if we put them into action. The wetland birds tell us a really important message. Things like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act has restored or enhanced 20 million acres through their joint ventures programs, through U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and Ducks Unlimited projects. And these populations are rebounding, not just gadwalls, but mallards, other species. These are all hunted species, and we've developed the knowledge to be able to hunt them sustainably. It's an incredible message. It's one we can't forget. American oyster catchers were just recently declining, but thanks to work from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they developed an Atlantic shorebird business strategy. These species, just in the last 15, 20 years, have started to turn it around and showing real positive responses to conservation action on the ground. So conservation works. It really does work. The greater sage-grouse, well, we're trying to work on this species. The Natural Resource Conservation Service's Sage-Grouse Initiative has already enrolled 1,000 ranchers for sustaining grazing on 2 million acres in 11 western states. That sagebrush habitat, that convergence of ranching and all these different pressures on that habitat, we need to figure that out if we want to not have the next heath end disappear and have that be the Gunnison Sage-Grouse or the greater sage-grouse. We don't want to lose this species. Once you see that behavior, that lecking behavior, you're going to say that to yourself. We can't lose that thing. That is amazing. And of course, the California Condor, saved by the Endangered Species Act. It's truly our last line of defense in many of these cases, but we don't want to get there. We don't want to get to the Endangered Species Act, but we might have to in some cases. If we get there, we have to use it. But on top of all these things, we do have to remember that some of our most successful conservation action will come from proactive partnership-based conservation. And we need to do this before species become endangered. It's the most cost-effective way to really move forward. So we have to address the causes of decline. That's where we go to next. That's where we have to ask, why are these species declining? Well, we know habitat is one of the most critical parts of this entire equation. Energy sprawl, deforestation due to agriculture, and of course, we have to remember that a lot of these species are migratory and they occupy multiple worlds, not just the United States, but they're in the tropics, places like Haiti, Belize, Argentina. We have to build these partnerships with these other countries, ultimately, to save a lot of these species that move over such broad landscapes. This isn't a very good graph, but this is the result of a lot of work from U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the Smithsonian to address and quantify the actual threats, the direct mortality of things like cats and buildings and wind turbines. And it's difficult to really put this into play, but we can actually put in action simple bird-friendly measures to reduce the overall mortality that these different direct threats have on birds. So what are the lessons of the passenger pigeon? Well, I think the first lesson is knowledge is key. Having that biological information, both the monitoring place, which we do in many cases, to tell us and warn us when species are declining or when they're stable and increasing. There's a lot that can be learned there as well. And that the research, the scientific information, is key to ultimately figuring out what's limiting these populations, what's driving these populations down. And then we can address those threats. It's the only way you can do it. Habitat. America has an incredible legacy of protecting habitat all across the United States. We need to continue that legacy. We need to continue to invest in these programs. And of course, management. I feel like hunters have really taught us an important lesson with ducks and waterfowl. They taught us that we can actually sustain populations of hunted species if we understand. We have a good foundation of their biology, we have a good solid understanding of the habitat requirements, and we can move forward with sustainable populations of ducks and actually see them increase in time. We have to apply these game strategies to non-game species much more than we're doing now. This is going to be the key, applying knowledge, habitat protection, and ultimately management to the protection of birds. So how do we avoid the next passenger pigeon? Well, we have the tools to prevent extinction. We have to keep birds common when they're common. We have to preserve abundance. I would say in the end that America's report card's pretty mixed. In fact, I'd say America, you're probably going to summer school. Not a good outcome. There are serious concerns, but I'm optimistic. I think we can move forward. I feel like that we have the knowledge to move forward, and we have committed people to do that. And we can see that just by how these 23 groups came together to put this effort in place. And we have to protect America's investments with various policies and actions that will bring us into this next century, where we have a whole multitude of challenges, including climate change, that make things even more difficult to predict. Conservation works. When we have the will to conserve, we can make a better future for all birds and people. And we have to figure out how we can get birds to live in these human-dominated landscapes much more sustainably. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Pete. I'd like to, in the last remaining moments of the press conference, open the floor to questions from the attending media, if you have any. We have quite a few members of the media in the room, so I'll open the floor. Jane? And Jane, if all media can address, say who you are and what outlet you're from.
Sure. Hello? Jane Lee with National Geographic. I had a question for
Pete.
Pete. Sorry.
That's okay.
You mentioned earlier that saving birds is good for our economics. Can you elaborate on that? Like, what do you mean?
Sure. I mean, from a variety of perspectives, once we get to the Endangered Species Act, then it's going to cause all sorts of costs. It becomes a much more expensive thing to sort of pursue. By keeping species common when they're common, they're not conservation reliant. Becoming conservation reliant is a very expensive thing. Kirtland's warbler costs millions of dollars every year to maintain over time. We don't want to get to that point. Healthy bird habitat means healthy human habitat as well. So there are a number of other costs that I could elaborate on, whether it's disease or other things that also have costs associated with them. West Nile virus cost us enormous amounts of money.
Any other questions? Susan? Susan, if you could just wait for the mic. They're bringing you a mic right now.
Are you seeing any sort of reaction from people who hear about birds spreading bird flu or West Nile virus spreading by birds? Are people getting scared of birds, do you think?
Yeah, I think in certain countries, by all means, when H5N1 first emerged, there were several countries that were actually killing birds, killing wild birds. We didn't see that in the United States, thank goodness. I think people here were alarmed. I think it was a wonderful opportunity to sort of talk about migration and the role that birds play internationally. But I haven't seen fear here in that. I don't push that story that birds are dispersing it all that much. I mean, they're probably moving it, but it's part of that equation. I think globalization more broadly is a big driver of the emergence of diseases, zoonotic diseases, and the spread of zoonotic diseases. So, yeah, I haven't seen that.
Anyone else? Last question? Can I open the floor? No? All right, then with that, I'd like to thank John and Dan and Pete for the presentation today, and to all the partners in the room as well. Thank you very much. And also, I'd encourage you to go visit the folks over here to your right.